Hello, everyone. Welcome to another great webinar from cpaacademy.org. My name is Vaughn Smith. I will be your moderator for today's session on D&I one-on-one, multicultural diversity. So glad you all have taken time out of your busy day to spend the next hour with us. We have some great information from some presenters who are right there on their webcams with us today, and we want to make sure that everything is working. You can see their wonderful faces, and you can hear my voice, and you can see that title slide on the screen. So go ahead and let me know in the questions panel. That's over there on that right-hand side. Go ahead and click on it, say hello, tell us where you're tuning in from. And the place that you are typing into right now is the place that you can let me know if you are having any technical difficulties during this session. Do my best to answer you as quickly as possible. And of course, this is a place where we encourage you to type in questions for our presenters at any time. I will go ahead and send over a full report to them if we do not get to your questions live during the session, but please do use that questions panel for interaction. All right, let's check in with the audience, see where we are tuning in from. Looks like we have got Los Angeles, California, and we have got Florida. Of course, I always pick that out since I'm in Florida as well. Looks like we've got Chicago, and we've got DC, and New York City, and Oklahoma, and Texas. All right, looks like we're tuning in from everywhere. Thank you so much for letting me know that we are doing A-OK. Let's talk about credit. This session qualifies for 1 CPE credit. You need to remain logged in for 50 minutes. Answer our polls. We have 4 for you today. You only need 3 for credit, but answer them all because it's fun to answer polls. Make sure you hit that submit button so it registers for your credit. You have a handout over there in the handouts panel for you to download and follow along. You can also find that handout in your CPA Academy account, and that account is where you'll find your issued CPE credit within about 24 hours. You'll have a recording of the session and all those great resources, including an evaluation. We always love to hear from you. All right, I have covered everything I need on my end. I am going to turn this over to Jina. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vaughn. And I mean, you forgot to mention the people in my hometown, Maryland. I always see somebody from Maryland on the program. Anyway, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. In this session, we're going to be talking with Dr. Anton Lewis, and we're talking about multicultural diversity. So first, I'd like to introduce my guest. I was talking with a colleague about data trends and research around diversity and race in the accounting profession. And he immediately insisted that I meet his friend, Anton, who'd done a lot of work in this space. Anton, or I should say Dr. Lewis, teaches accounting at Valparaiso, if I said that right, University in Northwest Indiana. He's an author, a podcaster, a researcher. He's focused on the intersection and implications of race in the accounting profession. So Anton, I'm happy to have you join us today, despite your love of the Liverpool Football Club. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jina. And thank you very much to Etienne Consulting for inviting me onto this webinar series. I would like to say a couple of things before we begin. As you've probably heard, I'm from Britain, I'm from England, West Yorkshire, for anybody who knows a bit about Great Britain. And secondly, I'm afraid I will have to correct Jina on her accusation that I'm a supporter of Liverpool Football Club, when in fact I'm an ardent Manchester United fan. I'm going to leave it there, should we sour this particular webinar that we've got going at the moment. I'll just leave it there. Yes, Jina.
That is my mistake. And of course, Liverpool is such a storied club. Anyway, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about the conversation. I was reading, I mean, I've listened to your podcast. You know, we've had Anton hosts a forum that meets on a monthly basis with a bunch of different educators, and I've been grateful enough to participate. So I've heard some of these wonderful discussions and thought this would be great to bring to this series. But can we break it down? So if we start with, when we talk about multicultural diversity, can we frame the conversation? Because I know you focus on your work is a lot of on race. So why are we even talking about culture and race when we're talking about the accounting profession? Why does it matter to us as professionals?
Well, I think first and foremost, it matters as professionals because we want to have, I believe all of us, representation from all. In many ways, businesses in general have focused on the bottom line as the marker of success. And I think we've moved into a different epoch, if you like, where the bottom line is important, but also we must think about environmental and social factors as well. And that's really where multiculturalism kind of comes into play here. This idea that it's not good enough just to make a profit. We want to make a profit where all are included within our ambit. And accounting is no different in that regard. And there's also something else to add here as well. You know, one of the core tenets I have always said in accounting is to be fair and to be trusted in the information that we actually produce. Yeah, impartiality is our key. So, you know, to be fair, out of many professions, impartiality, not just of the financial information that we produce, but impartiality in those who present that information, so that we have representation from people of color, we have representation from our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ plus community, that we have representation from women, that we have representation from those of a lower socioeconomic class, i.e. in British parlance, read working class, so that everybody has a fair chance to progress in the profession that we love and call our own.
Right. You know, it's interesting about what you said. So I wrote down a couple of things. By the way, if I look down, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just taking notes. You got me thinking about, in today's business climate you were mentioning, not only is it important to think about profits from those perspectives or think beyond profit, but we also know two things. One, the employee base is becoming increasingly more diverse simply because of the passage of time, if for no other reason because of demographic shifts, which include immigration patterns, not just birth rates and identity changes like what we've seen in the census. More people in the most recent census reported to be multicultural and multi-ethnic rather than, and it wasn't a question of new births in the United States. So there's that. This diverse workforce wants to have a career with purpose. And so part, I think, of that cultural awareness is to align my purpose to my work in this profession. And I'm not just showing up to do some things on a calculator. Well, we don't use calculators anymore, but to do accounting stuff and leave. And then the other thing is prospective clients. Our new business owners today are more likely to be minority and millennial than anything else. And they have this view of diversity as being multicultural, intersectional. Nobody is just one thing anymore. So that's part of the discussion. I mean, those are the things, I don't know if you're going to have any reactions or responses, but those are the things that, okay, before we ask this, before we do this any further, and before we get fired to start, Vaughn, should we just go ahead and do our first polling question?
Sure, we can go ahead and do that right now. Why not? Let's go ahead and bring up poll 1. I think it's a perfect time. So how do you identify? So this is poll number 1 of 4. We keep our polls open for about 60 seconds to allow you to get your votes in. Poll number 1. And because it's so silent, I'm going to fill the space with just some random banter of, it's about 30 seconds into this poll. See those votes coming in.
I'll say this, Vaughn, about the question. I'm realizing it'd be nice if we had you could check more than one. But anyway, too late. It's not the way this is.
Oh, that's a very good point. So yes, of course, feel free to use the questions panel as well. You can go ahead and put in any type of response you would like. Of course, make sure you do answer in the poll box because that does register for your CPE credit. There are no wrong or right answers. As long as you answer, it goes for your credit. All right, wonderful. Very good point, Jina. We're going to go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. Thank you, everyone, for your responses. Jina, back to you.
Yeah, I was thinking about answering the question myself, and I thought, I'm biracial, and I'm a person of color. So, which gets me to another question then. Anton, when we were talking as a part of our planning, you said something that I had not really thought of, which now I know is true. this isn't a quote, but this is what I wrote down. When we talk about race, it's as if people of color are an homogenous group. And so we talk about race, ethnicity, etc., as if it's Black, white, Asian, Latino, gay, cisgender, right? We put everybody in singular buckets. That is part of the challenge, right? When we talk about multicultural, we could be zooming in on any one group and still be multicultural.
Right. Let me just go back, because there are two kind of questions there, and I'll go to the first one that we had before our poll. And you know, as we talk about the changing needs, I think essentially of our society and accounting's place within that, I think we have to recognise, and you know, if you read any of the AICPA kind of narratives around diversity, you will see the call for the business case for diversity. That, as you've mentioned, clients themselves are expecting to see more diverse accountants in whatever capacity, be they auditors, be those doing assurance work, other facets of financial service provision. And secondly, there is also a push from Generation X, Generation Z, to actually see more diverse work colleagues, and not only see them coming in, but also see them at all levels of accounting organizations or in organizations as a whole, which actually means that it's no good anymore to be able to have the C-suite that is ostensibly pale and male. Okay, we've got to have that diversity in there. And so those are the kind of more current pushes for why multiculturalism, why examining diversity and inclusion within the area of accounting is quite important, and why I think the business case for diversity is pushed, i.e. there's also a profit motive behind the push to be more diverse. There is one caveat, though, I will push back against on the business case for diversity, and it's certainly something that I examine in much of my writings. This connection between profit and doing the right thing does have an expiry date, inverted commas, and that is, what about the reverse? What about when the business case for diversity is inverted, i.e. engaging in diversity actually leads to a loss, not a profit? And that seems hypothetically nonsense, right? How can it be? How can we create a situation where engaging in diversity work would actually harm profits? Well, actually, we've seen that happen. In the last administration, the Trump administration, I know there are lots of politics around this and contention. I'm not going to get into that. I will highlight that the administration within its last days did mandate potential penalties for those companies engaging in federal contracts, some of the big four and some of the mid-tiers, should they engage in various D&I trainings. Think here implicit bias training. Think here trainings around privilege. Think here trainings with that scary word, critical race theory, which I will probably digress and have a little bit of a chat about, because it's quite a contentious term and really is a trigger term, as Jina and I have pointed out, and it needs a little bit more explaining, I think. But with this in mind, it meant that at that time, if you were, for example, tendering for some tax work and you were the big four, the question arose, you know, you're a big four, you're deeply engaged in D&I and D&I trainings, but you could potentially lose the contract because the administration at the time is against it. So therefore, by definition, the business case for diversity doesn't really exist in that way. And what does this mean? To me, it means that irrespective of whether it is harmful to the company going forward, and it seems counterintuitive, we still must do the right thing. There's a social justice case here. Remember, we are professionals. No matter which way the political winds blow, we have to stay true to our own prescribed traits of impartiality, of pushing for the better things in society. At least that's my take, Jina.
So many things here. We could just spend the rest of our conversation in this space. But one of the things I get frustrated by when we talk about the business case is we talk about the business case and try to tie it back to the right thing to do. And I think the right thing to do is important, but I'm not holding it against an organization or a company that they want to be profitable. So I think that we need to be able to decouple the business case into two pieces, because the right thing to do supersedes profit in a lot of ways. You know, there are companies that have to change their entire business model because it's the right thing to do. How waste gets disposed of, for example. It's not a question of cost, it's a question of protecting the environment and protecting human life. So that's the one thing. And then you said, okay, this is going further back. It seems like it's disconnected, but I wrote down C-suite, pale and male. And my first reaction is, that takes time. We're not going to be spontaneously diverse at the partner level because today we recognize its importance. We need people to move up the ranks. And the partners today can't be more diverse than the staff of 15 years ago. So how do we address that, even if we are more aware today? And we do want to be more diverse. How do these things reconcile?
Well, and again, you raised some brilliant questions here, Jina. Yes, in terms of the business case for diversity, like so many things, it's shades of grey. Okay, of course, how can you? Yeah, should you go down the social justice line and destroy a business model? No, we can't do that, and it can't all be done instantly. At the same time, does that mean we completely ignore the social justice model? Well, for the reasons I've already stated, we can't do that. We've got to find a nuanced point in between all that, and it actually requires thought. It requires a more delicate understanding of the issues at hand, and therefore requires people to tune in and get involved in trainings like this, have discussions at work about the nuances and how we get to where we need to be, particularly where the business case for diversity piece rests. Secondly, moving on to the other point about, you know, more or less, how do we get there? When do we get there? Can we even get there? And that I think is a very important point, Jina. There's this feeling, I think, that's often unsaid that we can't do this, particularly with people of color, or that it'll just take forever. But here's the rub. We've actually done this before. I think people fail to realize that if we go back into our history where accounting is concerned, there was a time within both accounting in the United Kingdom and accounting in the United States where women were not CPAs, they weren't accountants. And this is going back 100 years or so. And it was through various pushes of feminism, through various pushes for women's rights and representations past World War II, etc., we finally came to an accommodation with a group, women who have been historically subjugated for such a long time, where actually we have managed to get more women into our accounting profession, not just in the profession, but many levels, including the C-suite, of which I've just mentioned. Now, again, I have to throw out another caveat. We are not done where women's success within accounting.
You're going to make me do this. Hold on. This isn't part of these aren't part of the slides, folks, but I did happen to pull this. And so you can see here, women are 39% of partners and 44% of staff and almost half of all CPAs. So you're saying we've made progress.
Yes. But, and it looks great, doesn't it? But, you know, this is why we need nuance. We need to actually investigate what this really means. So as we look to approaching what seems to be parity here, we still have some real fundamental questions just on the woman experience in accounting and all of the professions and businesses. The domestic split of labor is a well-known problematic for women in the workforce. And this is no less of an issue in accounting, which means that even though we have these numbers that seem statistically to be approaching parity, we don't have that window into women's personal lives that say you're going to have to somehow produce personal and family acrobatics to make sure that the kids have enough food, to make sure that the kids are picked up from schooling, from camp, to make sure that the house runs domestically correctly. There is an assumption, therefore, of a 50-50% split within domestic work, and that is not true. And that means that although we are reaching in some ways, as I mentioned statistically by the data you showed there, Jina, a parity, the experience and the quality of women's professional life, because of this domestic piece that I've mentioned, arguably is far, far less. And this has been compounded, as I've understood, recently with the situation we all underwent with COVID-19, where women, even though they were at home, were having to perform at the same, if not higher standard, and had to do something close to 70 to 80% of the domestic work. And this is what I mean about looking at the spaces in between, because if we just look at the stats, it looks like we're there, but we're not really there. We're always working towards this. And I know in some ways it seems, well, do you know what, you've just said we've made great progress, but actually we haven't. And in some ways that is what I'm saying. But in an overview, when we look at, sorry, just let me finish that point. With an overview, Jina, I just wanted to use gender as an example of how far we've gone. We're not quite where we need to be, but that is an example of progress. And it's what we need to do where people of color, multicultural diversity that we're talking about, we need to get there. And we need to keep pushing this agenda so we have parity or something close to some of these figures there, while acknowledging we've got a ways to go across a whole range of issues as well. Sorry to interrupt you, please.
No. You said we're not there. We're there, but we're not really there. And I thought, yeah, you're right. Looking at those numbers, it seems like we're making progress. The challenge is that the norms that we're basing things on, we're measuring success on male norms. So a woman, in order to be successful, has to show up more like a man than a woman. So she has to be careful that she's not seen as soft. Or, you know, if we take this to the question of race, somebody who's Asian, if they're too quiet, they buy into the stereotype. Or somebody who's Black, male, he's too aggressive. Female, she's the angry Black woman. And so when we start to talk about are we there but we're not nearly there, we like to measure progress in hard numbers. But the reality is it's more complicated. And you said this already, it's nuanced. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I know during our conversation, we also brought up, I think you brought up intersectionality, which lays perfectly into this part of the conversation, because you can't just say women in this whole dialogue we've had and not talk about women of color or women with disabilities or women who are part of the LGBTQ community, whether it's identity or biology.
But this goes on, Jina, to the point that you raised in the question that you just posed, which was the reference you made to homogeneity, that we have this tendency to need and want to box different groups and then make an attempt, if we're lucky, to benchmark the progress of those particularly boxed groups. And the idea and notion of intersectionality here, and let me just be clear about what I mean by intersectionality. Intersectionality was a concept really coined by a critical race theorist called Kimberly Crenshaw, round about, I think 1989, 1990s, where she spoke about the experience of those from subjugated groups that is not one thing or another. So you have just mentioned the experience of Black women professionals. Those experiences will arguably be some of racialized microaggressions, some will be of racialized gendered aggressions. Think here, maybe as a woman, one might be chastised for having the hemline of one's skirt to be too short, or, and again, Jina I know in some of our previous conversations can speak to this, being mandated within the work environment to wear a skirt in the most sexist manner possible. It may be in terms of race that the Black woman professional is seen as being a sapphire, read harsh, shrill, not a good team player. and therefore that is a racialized take upon that and somewhat gendered. The point I'm trying to argue is that these two things, the gendered and the racialized experience for the Black woman professional, aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They combine, they intersect in particular ways, which must have policies that both address the gendered and racialized nature. And that's kind of what Kimberly Crenshaw really brought to the fore. And that's what we talk about, intersectional approaches. And the intersectional approaches are really quite important here when we go back to the point that you made about norms in multiculturalism and what we're trying to get to in professional environments like accounting, where we separate into our separate buckets, male, white, middle class, and straight, as if these norms were separate. They're not separate. They're part of what combined to be the true archetype of an accountant, the measure that must be reached. If you are not of that measure in an intersectional sense, say you're a Black professional, a Black woman professional, a Black woman professional who's a member of the LGBT plus community, how can you ever reach that male, white, middle class, straight archetype, able-bodied included on that? And so by definition, one gets pushed aside from being seen as the most authentic, therefore read potentially the one given the benefit of the doubt where promotions are concerned, or being brought onto the very best projects without a word being said, without there being any actual push, any actual written word to act against you. You are stigmatized by the outset by an inability to appreciate yourself as you are. And these are the issues that we really do have to wrestle with within, I think, the workspace as a whole, within many professions, and particularly within accounting.
I don't even know where to go. There are 1,000 places I want to go. But all right, so I'm going to look. I don't want to ignore the Q&A. And there's somebody here, it's not a question, but it's a statement. Shouldn't accounting be colorblind? You just talked about neutrality and that we have to be objective. And does part of that objectivity mean we can't get caught up in this type of dialogue?
And yes, we move on to this issue and notion of colorblindness. It's always, sorry, please, Jina.
Well, I was going to say, we're about to jump into a conversation focusing a bit on race and color. Before we do that, let's go ahead and do that second polling question.
Perfect timing. I am going to go ahead and pull that poll up. It should be on your screen now. So this is poll number 2. And the question is, has the topic of race ever been a cause of tension or discomfort in your organization's D&I efforts?
I wanted to include this question because I know with my clients, often when we start having conversations about what is it that you want to achieve or what are you focused on, and I'm not saying this is a question, I'm just sort of filling the time here on the poll. The two issues that come up immediately are race and gender, almost every time. And so, but within in the accounting profession, if you look at our history, we've spent as a profession a disproportionate amount of time on the women's, talking about women and getting them into the partnership pipeline. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that thought as we, like I said, filling this time on the poll.
I know the feeling very well. So we're going to go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, poll is closed. Back to you to continue this great conversation.
Okay. So
yes.
Should we be talking about this stuff was the question.
Well, yes, and let's take it to the notion of colorblindness, because it's really quite important. And how does this operate in the real world? Well, the usual way this operates is for someone to say, I don't see color, so therefore I can't possibly be racist. I can't possibly discriminate. And that is a conscious statement, right? If I don't see it, how can I don't see this, so I can't in any way discriminate. So we now have to have a conversation between conscious bias and unconscious bias, implicit bias and non. And what I mean by implicit bias is you can make the statement that you're colorblind and yet still unconsciously have preferences for the dominant majority, read white, male, straight, as I've just said, an accounting archetype.
But that's normal. That's human.
You're right, it's human. And this is important because it gets at this idea of what we should do, this stated aim, which is better, and who we really are and what we really do. And it's actually quite important because
and it's as if that gap means we're bad.
Well, yes, it's not really recognizing that that's part of the journey that we have to take within ourselves to change. To admit, to believe in colorblindness in many ways is to frankly ignore the reality of being. If everybody in our society is colorblind, then we don't have Black Lives Matter. If everybody in our society is colorblind and has been for some time, then we don't have mass incarceration of Black and brown peoples to the level that we do within the United States. Just to say one thing there. If we have colorblindness, we would somewhere see proportional representation of Black and brown peoples across the board within our accounting firms. And we don't see this. And, you know, in truth, we need to recognize that what we say and what we do are two different things. I'll just make this point. There's a very interesting researcher called Eduardo Bonilla Silva, if I've got his name correctly. And he, a number of years ago, pointed out that when people were asked questions in a research setting about their views on diversity, on race, there would be a microsecond pause for the questions about, you know, how do you feel about Black people in your particular workplace? How do you feel about African Americans and their ability to engage in leadership roles?
And you're not talking about the implicit association test. You're talking about a different
I'm talking about something, it's kind of in the same bundle, but I'm talking about a slightly different process because he really was a leader in this area. Because what Bonilla Silva pointed out was there's an internal dialogue in our colorblindness that says, just for a microsecond, actually, do you know what, if internally, even almost beyond the notion of thought in some ways, I actually may have an issue with Black professionals in a leadership position or women in a leadership position. But I know it's wrong of me to think that. I know it's not correct. And I have to think about the correct answer to that question. It's microseconds, but it is representative of an internalized filter to say the right thing. And that's important because that's the level of the implicit nature of the bias that we are trying to conquer. And it really admits, it would be more useful in terms of progress to admit that our first reaction was a more truthful reaction, and we need to work on that piece, which is why, again, webinars like we're engaging in at the minute are actually so important, because we need to actually get to the depth of why we hold such deep-seated views of those in certain stigmatized groupings, from class groupings to gender groupings to race groupings to groupings around sexuality and beyond.
Right. So they're not just here, but I can tell you, and I've been doing this webinar now for 1.5 years. Shameless plug, every other Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Okay, but this question has come up a lot about, should we be colorblind? We're leaving white people out of the equation, that kind of thing. And so as you were talking, I thought, okay, first of all, white is a race that doesn't get included, but there's also a really interesting discussion, and I would invite our attendees to perhaps explore this. Caucasian, there are multiple colors of white. Colorism exists not just individual groups that we call people of color, but within the white race. Caucasian has a span of color, and in the history of that, it's just fascinating. When we talk about multiculturalism, what we generally think about is non-white, but there's also culturalism that we need to contemplate, just to round out and include white in the conversation. And I try to do that a lot, because too often when we don't, either it sounds like we're trying to blame white people for all the problems of people of color, or that people who are white have no stake in this, and that this is only about people of color. And what that then might do is pit different groups of color, or different groups like straight versus gay, or people who have a disability against people who are able-bodied. And as a result of that, there can be these tensions between the different groups as we try to work through this. I don't know if you want to speak to that, this idea that there are animosities between different groups, and often all of those groups collectively against the group that we call white.
And you know, this is why I love regularly talking to Jina, because if you're feeling your head has just gone boom, mine has definitely just gone boom. Okay.
We often fall into, folks, we fall deep into the rabbit holes when we have these conversations, but we'll try to stay on topic here, because I do think this divisiveness is an important conversation that we don't have.
Well, so let me split this into two parts here. Let's deal with this idea of what we mean by white, and then move into the people of color kind of divisive piece. So when we talk about white, we have this tendency to believe it's a static issue, that it's a static, whatever it is fixed, right? That is not true. If, again, let me take you back into the past and think about what it means to be white. If we go back to the turn of the century, okay, we have white Americans, and then we have white inverted Italians coming over. We have white Irish coming over, and they're not white that we understand, okay? They themselves are experiencing prejudice. They themselves are experiencing many of the facets that people of color find at the time, with job employment, with being attacked, with all these kind of racialized issues. In fact, quite frankly, they are racialized. Now, what happens to both the Italian and the Irish groupings is that whatever we think of as white per se, they get absorbed into that. And so suddenly all these issues are no longer a factor. They're in, right? And that really
kind of like how everybody who's black is African American, but I don't want to change that subject. Sorry, I don't want to go that route.
That's right. So when we talk about white, it's not stable. There are different fractions within whiteness per se, and it's always been the case. So when we talk about white people and this getting into the white club, inverted commas, a club that gives you many privileges that other black and brown people might not have, we are talking about whiteness. And it goes back to the question of leaving white people out of the discussion. No, you're right. White people, therefore, have always been racialized, but they have been absorbed into whiteness. And therefore, in that process, in that sea of whiteness, one of the narratives around that, one of the kind of things that is prevalent but never said, is that we don't have a color, we're just people. And that's important, because once you're in that club, it makes you think that there was never anything else other than this homogeneous whiteness that you're in. It erases our past experiences. But if you are of Irish heritage out there, if you are of Italian heritage, and you ask or look into your family experiences, you will find what I'm talking about is quite true in terms of past discriminations.
Well, we also just want to acknowledge that white is the majority. And as a result of it being the majority group, there is an important conversation that we focus on the minority group, not to exclude the majority group, but because the majority group is the point of measure. That is the point of comparison. That is the benchmark, if you will, of normalcy, which is what you were talking about before.
Exactly. And it's getting white people to understand their relationship between being white in this time, moment in time, and the whiteness that surrounds them, the privileges that are there. These are what black and brown people are really wanting white people to be aware of. So as we go back to that discussion of leaving white people out of the discussion, that's not true. You are so integral to that discussion that it's untrue.
Well, but it's framed in the negative. That's all I mean by that. They're left out of the conversation of who we're trying to support and help, and almost framed as if they've done something wrong, which is why we're trying to help.
But that's my point, Jina. This idea that they've done something wrong isn't you individually as a white person. It's the fact that you swim within the water of whiteness that is basically imperceptible. Again, a common analogy I use is the fish in the fishbowl that can't see the water that they swim around. Okay, that is whiteness. That is the piece that is very damaging in our society. And you as an individual,
it's damaging all of us, by the way.
That's right. And you may not do anything, or you're a good person, but because you're surrounded by this harming water, yeah, it is important for you to be involved in the discussion of changing what that is. And
Right.
that benefits all people, white, black, or brown. Because the other part of whiteness, this water of which we swim around, is that it hides the harm of this racialized practice so prevalent in our society to white people themselves, and always has, historically speaking, as well. And again, I could go down in the weeds to really explore that, but I want to move on to this other question
Well,
that you
I
highlighted.
think this other question might be where we land for a good part of this last segment. So before we
Right.
do that, let's go ahead and do our third polling question. And then I'm making a note, we're coming back to the animosities between different groups.
Okay, we have poll 3. Is multicultural awareness an intentional part of your organization's D&I efforts? So this is poll 3 for your CPE credit. We'll have one more poll before the conclusion of this webinar.
Unfortunately, I don't think this question sequences anywhere into our conversation. So folks, this is your opportunity to get CPE, if nothing else.
Awesome. All right, we're about halfway through this poll.
Did you hear the thunder in the background over here, by chance?
No, I
Good.
didn't. I was
Just in
hoping.
case there are any strange sounds on my part, it's either thunder or my dog snoring. I just want everybody to know it.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I'm on mute most of the time because there's been some rumbles around my area as well. So we're gonna go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. All right, poll 3 is closed. Back to you.
So we're going to have one more poll for everybody just to know we know about it. And so I'm thinking, Anton, we should plan for 10 minutes because we're going to run long. So I want us to go back to this idea that we have people of color, we have whites. You've just talked about that. Now we zoom in on the people of color. We have different groups that, because of this dialogue, are potentially, no, look at me, no, look at me, I'm more important. Is that real or is that imagined?
I'm afraid it's real. It's very real. And unfortunately, part of the racial calculus, if you like, of society out there. Remember I said that we have the Italians and the Irish who weren't white in the past, but were absorbed into whiteness, right? That really talks, therefore, about a racialized hierarchy with whites at the top and blacks at the bottom. Right. OK, that's part of the premise. And we see the hard fight historically of Irish, those of white Irish heritage and Italian heritage, fighting to get to that top spot. Everybody else is fighting to get there too. So read Asian, read South Asian, and all the way at the bottom, traditionally at that hierarchy are those considered black, but there's nuance. It's always nuance. So when we talk about black, and I'm going to bring myself in here to put myself into the mix, we talk about African American blackness. Now, here's the rub, right? If you don't see me on camera, okay, to the American ear, I'm not going to sound like I'm black. I'm certainly not African American, okay? I'm going to sound like I'm white British, yeah? And that's important because we often, for whatever reasons, attribute different stereotypes, good and bad, to different facets of what blackness means. And at the very bottom of, in this society, it's different in Britain, by the way. In Britain, African Americans, at least to my mind, have a slight edge over Black British in terms of acceptability and interest. So it's different in different spaces.
Well, but
right?
it's exactly the flip here, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And that matters. And so if you come in as a South Asian, if you come in as an Asian, if you come in from Africa or an African country, one thing you understand very clearly is that you define yourself upon this racialized hierarchy as being as far away from genuine blackness, read African American blackness, as possible. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because that is the fuel of the people of color fight within one another, because we generate stereotypes about one another as we fight to climb up this hierarchy toward whiteness, towards genuine acceptability, towards this idea that we can be accepted fully into the society that we're in. And it's of great harm, because really what we're looking at in our aims here for meritocracy, inequality that I think we all want, we need to upend this racialized hierarchy in the first place. We need to destroy it so everybody is seen as equal in the first place. But we can't do that, right? If, as we said, one, white people are not locating themselves in this discussion in terms of whiteness that I've read. And number two, we people of color are not disavowing the very same stereotypes that are racialized about us in the air that we apply to one another. And we find this in the Latinx community, we find this in the South Asian community, we find this in the Asian community, we find this in the African American community, where we all have this animosity that essentially does the one thing that we need to avoid. It separates us. We need to come together, and I mean everybody. This is not about attacking white people. It's about attacking whiteness. Why? Because whiteness in the sea that you swim around separates you. You are our brothers and sisters, and we are your brothers and sisters. And if we want to, we cannot do the upending of this system and get to the place that we need to be without working together. It's the only way I see this. And again, that same working together piece applies equally to all people of color within this society. That is the work that needs to be done.
Well, and so there's two things there. One is just a comment, and you've used the word attack a couple of times. And I understand your point, but I also want to reinforce, at least for the audience today, what we're really talking about is trying to break down barriers. We're not trying to attack a group. We're trying to attack an issue, attack a problem. So I just didn't want it to be heard that way. And then the other thing is, the title of this is Multicultural Diversity. And we've spent a lot of time talking about race, but I think you've done a wonderful job, a beautiful job actually, of integrating the fact that underlying different races in this country, due to how those different groups have come into the United States, some through migration, some through, we know the history in the United States through slavery. When we talk about race, we are also talking inherently about multiculturalism. And I don't think that people, I think people don't see those two as related. So in other words, if we're talking multicultural, we're talking different religions, we're talking different ethnicities, we're talking different countries of origin. We're not talking about race. And to some degree, that makes sense, because from any different country, multiple races come from that country. On the other hand, if we look at race solely as a question of color of skin, we are really marginalizing that conversation really down, as in this country do a particularly good job of boiling it down to black and white. And so can you talk a little bit about, I'm looking at the time, can you talk a little bit about the interconnectedness between multiculturalism and race?
Yes, I can, and I'm going to give a bit of a shameless plug for my own book, Counting Black and White Beans. And in that book, I actually compare the Black British experience to the African American experience. Two sets of Black accountants, but from two differing cultures. And in that space, in certain aspects of my analysis, we find that there are synergies in their experiences, and we find there are differences in their experiences. We find, for example, just educationally, being an accountant on a practical sense in Britain, anybody can do a degree. You can do an art degree and become an accountant. In America, you'd better have an accounting degree. Okay, we find that in the British experience, there are more of those from the African heritage in terms of their colonialized experience going into British UK accounting than we find is similar in the African American experience. If we expand some of this out further from the book into some of my other papers, okay, perhaps I mention it in one or two articles you've put up there, or even going back to my doctoral studies. As I spoke about Black per se, there have been traditional in Britain descriptions of black as being black and minority ethnic. It's a hazy term I don't love to use, but that can mean that black politically can be inclusive of those of South Asian origin. If we do that, we find some of the racialized experiences were intersectionally intertwined with religion. So many of the South Asians that we talk about will have been from Muslim heritage, and I would talk to South Asian Muslim accountants who would say they would go into their British workplaces, accounting officers, and be offered a bacon sandwich. You can't do that. It's really offensive. Yeah. Direct macroaggressive behavior. We would hear various racial epithets being used, but also attacks against Islam. You know, mentioning of the Prophet's name in manners that really should not be done. And these aren't just racialized, they're embedded and rolled up within culture. And the same thing occurs within the US ambit as well. And so you're right. In fact, the truth of the matter is, you know, we must be, you're right, be aware of not falling down, particularly in the US, into this idea that when we talk about multiculturalism, it's really a byword for the black and white binary. So, you know, again, in this conversation, we have yet to really have a meaningful conversation about indigenous people within our profession in our accounting profession. I would like to do the work I do in that regard for our indigenous First Nations peoples, but there's no one around from my vision to do that. We've got lots of work to do, and so we don't want to freeze our idea of what race means solely to this black and white boundary and just ignoring various aspects of faith, of culture, and other facets. Again, we've got to be nuanced, we've got to be open-minded, we've got to be willing to accept what is rather than what we wish to pigeonhole it to be.
By the way, when you brought that up, I just wanted to pull this up because one of the things you'll notice here is you talked about Native American. What is the other term? Why is it escaping me?
It's First Nations.
Alaskan Native, First Nation, indigenous people. That percentage is so small in the accounting profession, it doesn't even qualify to have its own slice of the pie. It falls into other. And included in other here is multiracial. So it's just, it's interesting to hear about all of that. And one of the things that I think is coming out of this conversation, and I don't mean just between you and I, but the conversation around diversity and inclusion in the profession, which answers the question, by the way, that it came in earlier about, is this even important? One of the things that this answers is it creates awareness for what all of those microaggressions are. It's not just a black and white issue. It's about religion. It's about age. It's about gender. And it's about ethnicity and background. And that's important because as our clients become more diverse, and as our clients look to our firms to be more diverse, absent awareness of all of these differences, absent an understanding of the multicultural nature of us as individuals, back to the idea of intersectionality. We're not all any one thing. We run the risk of offending a lot of people in a lot of ways because society is more aware. Therefore, we as a profession need to be more aware. And you know, with that, before we go to our last polling question, I'm going to give you the last minute to share any final thoughts before we close it out.
Thank you, Jina. And, you know, I'm going to take you back to the last kind of few words you said there and pick out the word offense. This is really what is the core issue that we're trying to get at, I feel, within this webinar and within our work across multicultural diversity. We are in a space where we're afraid to talk about everything you've just brought up. And we need to be brave. Okay, we cannot handle this alone. We need to have these conversations in these spaces today, right now. And we're in a situation where we're afraid to lose our jobs. And if we are not brave to talk and risk offense and risk challenge to our core beliefs, then we're going nowhere fast. And that's what I mean about reaching across the divide to think about these things, to talk, to question, to engage in conversations and be risky. Look, we all know, we're all involved in finance. There is no return without risk. And we want the returns because They will be what make our profession and our society truly worth living in, and a place where we want to be, not a place that we think we can never get to. And so that's really what I would say there. And that's why I produce a podcast. It's why I write the books. It's why I'm busy bending poor Jina's ear basically every week in trying to find ways to get it out there and contact each and every body out there to engage and have these conversations. It's important. You are important. And you're the one last thing I will say is this. My own kind of quip, if you like, is that a voice is not a voice unless it is heard. You've got to get out there and have these conversations within your workspace, within your friend circle. And don't be afraid to risk. The benefits are out there for us. And I'll leave it at that particular point there before I walk myself into trouble. Thank you.
And
Jina.
before we end up hitting the wall on time, I think you've also lent it very nicely into the fact that this webinar series is structured as a conversation, so that when we hear other people talking and when we start to hear the vocabulary, hopefully what is happening for the attendees is that if you're with us on a regular basis, you start to feel a little more comfortable engaging in these conversations. So I invite everybody to join us. Our next one is coming up on July 22nd. Until then, Vaughn, our last polling question, so we can wrap this up.
All right, yes, I have launched that fourth and final poll up on your screens now. So this is just, what was the most valuable part of today's webinar? And feel free, once you've answered this, if you wanted to put any comments into the questions panel, more than happy to go ahead and share your thoughts. That would be wonderful. And while you're doing this last poll, I'll go ahead and do my housekeeping that we do when we close out our webinars here at CPA Academy. And of course, big thanks to Jina and Anton. That was just great. I just always love being on these sessions. I always feel very lucky to be your moderator on a lot of these. So thank you so much for all of that. And of course, for attendees for being with us today. We'll go ahead and process that CPE credit, get that into your accounts in about 24 hours. You'll have a recording of the session, you have the handouts, and have all of those fantastic resources. And of course, that evaluation, we definitely want to hear from you. And while I'm saying that, I'm going to go ahead and close this last poll out in 3, 2, and 1. So there we go. All right, and we have the contact information there for Jina up on the screen. And just want to again say thank you to both of you in person, even though you can't see my face, I can see yours. So just wanted to say that big thanks again. And yes, check out our schedule on cpaacademy.org, because I hope to see you all on future webinars. But for now, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all next time. All right, bye everyone. Bye Jina. Bye Anton.